The Book of Abraham is revered by adherents of the Mormon Church. This book is purported to have been written by Abraham, the father of faith of Christianity. However, controversy has been raging about the book, and in this video, we're going to look at the history of how the book was found, how it was translated, and the issues that arise. In July of 1835, an Irishman named Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, the home of the Mormons at the time, with an exhibit of 4 Egyptian mummies and papyri. The papyri contained Egyptian hieroglyphics, a form of ancient writing unreadable in America at the time. An excerpt of the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 236 reads, Joseph Smith was given permission to look at the papyri scrolls in the exhibit, and upon seeing them, he declared, one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Members of the Mormon Church raised money and bought the entire collection. 7 years later, Joseph finished translating the scroll and called it the Book of Abraham. An accompanying book, the Book of Joseph, was never translated. The papyri were lost soon after this and were thought to have been destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. As a result, there was no way to validate Joseph's translation, even though Egyptian hieroglyphics were soon deciphered by archaeological linguists. If the papyri had been relocated and translated in light of our later understanding of hieroglyphics, we would at least have been able to prove or disapprove the abilities of Joseph as a divinely inspired prophet of God. Without the confirmation of the lost papyri, the Pearl of Great Price, which is a collection of writings containing the Book of Abraham, was canonized as scripture by the LDS Church in October of 1880. Amazingly, and to everyone's surprise, the papyri were rediscovered in one of the vault rooms of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1966. The Mormon Church validated the authenticity of this papyri, and the Deseret News of Salt Lake City acknowledged their rediscovery on November 27, 1967. On the back of the papyri were drawings of a temple and maps of the Kirtland, Ohio area. So experts were certain that this is the original document from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham. The Mormon community celebrated the discovery. Hugh Nibley, then the professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, commented in the journal BYU Studies. The discovery of the Book of Abraham papyri is a far more momentous transaction than might appear on the surface, for it brought back into play for the first time since the angel Moroni took back the golden plates a tangible link between the worlds. With the papyri rediscovered and Egyptian hieroglyphics now decipherable for over 70 years, the Mormon world awaited confirmation of the true status and ability of Joseph Smith, the prophet who said he had the gift of divine prophecy and translation. Mormons hoped the rediscovery and retranslation will validate the Book of Abraham and Joseph's ability to translate the Book of Mormon. These two books were connected by the man who said he was divinely gifted as a translator. The Mormon Church hoped that the Book of Abraham will vindicate Joseph Smith as a true prophet of God. Both Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints scholars agree the pieces of papyrus scroll we have today were those possessed by Joseph Smith and used to produce the Book of Abraham. A positive identification is possible because one of the rediscovered scroll pieces, now called Papyrus Joseph Smith 1 PJS1, matches the picture in the Book of Abraham called facsimile number 1. According to the Book of Abraham chapter 1 verses 12 to 14, This picture or representation came at the beginning of the record, that is, the papyrus scroll. Scholars pored over the papyri, examining their contents and illustrations, comparing these to Smith's translation. Joseph copied 3 drawings from the Egyptian scrolls while creating the Book of Abraham, and he labeled them as facsimile number 1, number 2, and number 3. He placed these drawings in the Book of Abraham and provided explanations for what they represented. For years, Egyptologists examined these illustrations and believed Joseph's interpretations were false. Scholars recognized similarities between the drawings in the Book of Abraham and paintings discovered in Egyptian tombs. Facsimile number 1, for example, bore a striking resemblance to the paintings of embalming ceremonies involving the Egyptian god of embalming, Anubis. There were also some other notable differences, however. The head of the character Joseph drew standing over the table was not the head of a jackal, as it should have been to belong to the family of Anubis renderings. In addition, this figure was holding what Joseph described as a knife, something inconsistent with Anubis drawings. In spite of this, Egyptologists maintain the facsimiles looked like common configurations found in Egyptian books of the dead. Mormons, in defending their scripture, maintain the resemblance to these facsimiles are not sufficient to prove that Joseph Smith was lying in his translation. But with the rediscovery of the papyri in 1966, Mormons hoped to vindicate Joseph completely. The rediscovered papyri contained not only text, but the same drawings that Joseph had drawn into the Book of Abraham. It was now possible to determine if Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. Experts examined the illustrations on the papyri and looked closely at facsimile number 1. They discovered the complete illustration was not actually in the original papyri. There were 2 critical areas missing in the original Joseph inserted into facsimile number 1. The areas related to the head and the hands of the Anubis character, the very areas experts identified many years earlier, were missing. It was now obvious that Joseph reconstructed the facsimile on his own, lacking an accurate understanding of Egyptian practice and theology. The translations now began in earnest. Joseph Smith said facsimile number 1 depicted a bird as the angel of the Lord, with Abraham fastened upon an altar, being offered up as a sacrifice by a false priest. The pots under the altar were various gods: Elkanah, Libnah, Mamakra, Korash, Pharaoh, and so on. But Egyptologists translated the original papyri and discovered it was an embalming scene showing the deceased lying on a lion couch. Facsimile number 1 actually depicts the mythical embalming and resurrection of Osiris, Egyptian god of the underworld. Osiris was slain by his jealous brother Set, who cut up his body into 16 pieces and scattered them. The jackal-headed god Anubis is shown embalming the body of Osiris on the traditional lion-headed couch so that he might come back to life. In the original papyri, facsimile number 1 is attached to hieroglyphics from which Joseph created the beginning of the Book of Abraham. It begins with the words, "In the land of the Chaldeans, at the residence of my father, I, Abraham, saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence." That's the Book of Abraham chapter 1 verse 1. In reality, however, the hieroglyphics translate, "Osiris shall be conveyed into the great pool of corns, and likewise Osiris whore, justified, born to Tikebite, justified, after his arms have been placed on his heart, and the breathing permit, which Isis made and has been writing on it inside and outside, has been wrapped in royal linen and placed under his left arm near his heart. The rest of the mummy bandages shall be wrapped over it." the man for whom this book was copied will breathe forever and ever as the bars of the gods do. The document is not the writing of Abraham in Egypt, but is instead the opening portion of an Egyptian Shite ensensen or Book of Breathing, which is a late funerary text derived from the earlier and more complex Book of the Dead. This particular scroll was examined by experts, including Mormon experts who agree with the finding, and after analyzing handwriting, spelling, content, and other contextual issues, they determined that the papyri were written sometime during the late Ptolemaic or early Roman period, around 50 BC to 50 AD. This is problematic for Mormons, however, for if the papyri are only about 2,000 years old, they are far too new to have been written by the hand of Abraham. There is another facsimile in the Book of Abraham, revealing additional areas of mistranslation. Facsimile number 2, as it is described by Joseph Smith and included in the Pearl of Great Price, contains different scenes interpreted by Joseph Smith. They vary considerably in content. Kolob, signifying the first creation nearest to the celestial or the residence of God, stands next to Kolob, called by the Egyptians Olebish, which is the next grand governing creation near the celestial or the place where God resides. God sitting upon his throne, clothed with power and authority. This is one of the governing planets also, and is said by the Egyptians to be the sun, and to borrow its light from Kolob through the medium of Kaivandrash, which is the grand key. But again, the experts discovered Joseph's translations did not match the evidence. It is actually a rather common funerary amulet termed hypocephalus, so called because it was placed under a mummy's head. Its purpose was to magically keep the deceased warm and to protect the body from discretion by grave robbers. This type of amulet was very common, and several similar amulets have been recovered and translated over the years, confirming their nature and the fact they contradict Joseph's translation. None of the content translated by Joseph for the Book of Abraham appears on the amulet. It is not what Joseph claimed. Joseph Smith claimed facsimile number 3 depicted Abraham sitting upon Pharaoh's throne with the politeness of the king, with a crown upon his head representing the priesthood. King Pharaoh, whose name is given in characters above his head, signifies Abraham in Egypt. But this is contrary to the true translation of the hieroglyphic. The facsimile actually depicts the deceased being led before Osiris, the god of the dead, and behind the enthroned Osiris stands his wife, Isis. To make matters worse, areas of text retranslations identified by Mormon Church documents for generations, that is prior to the discovery of the papyri, also conflict with the true translations. Not only is Smith's translation related to the facsimiles untrue, every other portion of the papyri translation is also false. The piece of papyri, designated Papyrus Joseph Smith 11, PJS 11, was originally connected to PJS 1, from which facsimile number 1 was inserted. This was verified by Dr. Klaus Bauer, an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, who wrote, "They clearly adjoin as proposed. Papyrus fibers are always irregular and can be used, much like fingerprints, to check whether fragments come from the same sheet. In this case, the horizontal fibers on the left and the right edges of Papyrus Joseph Smith 1 and 11 respectively match exactly." This portion of the papyri has been translated by Professor Richard Parker of Brown University. Even before the original papyri were rediscovered, the Mormon Church had been in possession of a series of original Book of Abraham translation manuscripts. These manuscripts were used by Joseph Smith as his translation notes, and several had a mysterious set of symbols located in the left margin. For years, these were understood to be the Egyptian hieroglyphics from which all the English text was translated. Now, with the discovery of PJS11, experts finally located the series of hieroglyphics seen on the translation manuscripts for years. The Egyptian characters in the left margin of page 3 of the original Book of Abraham translation manuscript match a succession of Egyptian characters from the upper right column of a section of the PJS11 Book of Abraham scroll. In essence, the original translation notes have a series of Egyptian characters from the papyrus scroll copied down the left margin, indicating that the Book of Abraham was translated from this section of the papyrus scroll. But as you might have suspected by now, none of the true translation of the papyri matches the translation of Joseph Smith. Modern examination of the papyri did not provide the confirmation Mormons were hoping for, but it did confirm something important. Mormons had accepted the Book of Abraham for decades, believing the church's assertion that Joseph Smith translated it by the power of God as he had claimed. This manner of translation, allegedly guided by God, was the same mechanism by which Joseph claimed to translate the Book of Mormon. The false translation of the Book of Abraham, therefore, cast serious doubt on the Book of Mormon as well, forever debilitating Joseph's claim he was a true inspired prophet of God. Thousands of Mormons left the church as a result of the discovery, while thousands more are completely unaware of this important piece of evidence. The LDS Church has done its best to respond to two difficult problems with the Book of Abraham papyri. The papyri are not old enough to be what Joseph claimed, and they don't say what Joseph claimed. If the papyri were the record of Abraham while he was in Egypt, they will be the oldest extant manuscript of biblical material. According to Mormon scholars, the Book of Abraham was written about 4,000 years ago. Mormon prophets and teachers have always maintained the papyri purchased by Joseph Smith were the actual papyri drawn and written directly by Abraham. Early believers were repeatedly assured of this claim. There are several examples of this to be found in the early history of the church and the writings of those who were witnesses at this time in history. The earliest Mormon leaders and witnesses believed and maintained these papyri were, in fact, the very scrolls upon which Abraham and Joseph wrote. These papyri were considered to be the original scrolls until they were later recovered in 1966. After discovering the original papyri, scientists, linguists, archaeologists, and investigators, both Mormon and non-Mormon, examined them and agreed that the papyri were far too young to have been written by Abraham. They are approximately 1500 to 2000 years too late, dating from anywhere between 500 BC and 60 AD. Current Mormon defenses related to the age of the papyri have accommodated this late dating of the documents. Mormons' apologists now argue the papyri are later transcriptions and copies of the ancient scrolls written by Abraham. According to these apologists, the originals were written around 2000 BC, but the Book of Abraham copies are later copies dating to 500 BC to 60 AD. However, this explanation suffers from the following inconsistencies. First, this explanation contradicts 130 years of Mormon teaching in which leaders and witnesses describe the papyri as original writings of the patriarch Abraham, written by his own hand. Secondly, it is unreasonable to expect an upstanding upper-class member of Egyptian society to be buried with the copied records of an Israelite. History demonstrates the relationship between the Egyptians and the Israelites. It is extremely unlikely an Egyptian will be buried with a copy of Jewish history inserted into his sarcophagus as part of a pagan mummification process. Finally, the existing papyri don't reveal anything dating them in the Egyptian era Joseph Smith claimed. The content of the papyri should at least help verifying the date of the document, even if this content has been copied from an earlier document. But the papyri simply describe an ancient burial ritual and prayers consistent with the Egyptian culture in 500 BC. Nothing in the papyri hints specifically or exclusively to a time in history in which Abraham would have lived. Mormon leadership has struggled to answer this important question, and Mormon apologists have adopted two strategies to account for the mistranslation. Some Mormon apologists argue a portion of the papyri is still missing. They claim the Book of Abraham was translated from the missing papyri. Other apologists deny there is any missing papyri and offer a different explanation. This second group claims Joseph didn't actually use the papyri to create a word-for-word translation. In order to address the first response, we've got to determine if the papyri rediscovered in 1966 were the same ones used by Joseph Smith to translate the Book of Abraham. If we determine that these are in fact the same papyri, Mormon apologists cannot continue to claim the Book of Abraham came from a missing piece of papyrus. Mormon apologists also cite the fact that facsimile number 3, presently in the Book of Abraham, is missing from the original papyri set. If facsimile number 3 is missing from the original collection, isn't it possible more papyri with the text of the Book of Abraham are also missing? The answer to this question is no. Several pieces of papyrus were returned to the church in 1967. Of these papyri, 3 are particularly important. They are identified as JSP1, JSP11, and JSP10. The papyri read from right to left. These 3 pieces of papyri are connected to the Book of Abraham in an interesting way. The first piece, the JSP1, contains the ancient drawing from which facsimile number 1 has been derived. It fits perfectly with another piece of papyrus known as JSP11. The original manuscripts of the Book of Abraham, as they appear in Joseph Smith's Egyptian alphabet and grammar, reveal Joseph was using characters from his second papyrus, that is JSP11, when he translated the first chapter of the Book of Abraham. In Abraham chapter 1 verse 12, the patriarch Abraham allegedly said the following, "And it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me also, as they did those virgins upon this altar, and that you may have knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation of the commencement of this record." It's fairly clear, therefore, the picture shown as facsimile number 1 in JSP1 belongs at the start of the papyrus scroll, and Joseph Smith was claiming to translate from the very next portion of the papyrus, JSP11. The text of the Book of Abraham demonstrates the drawing appearing as facsimile number 1, JSP1, was located at the beginning of the scroll. A larger piece of papyri, JSP10, follows the smaller JSP11. While the name Abraham does not appear on any of the 3 pieces of papyri, the Egyptian name Hor appears on every piece, connecting them contextually. The name can also be seen in at least 9 places. While the original piece of papyrus that Joseph used to prepare facsimile number 3 is missing, Egyptologists have also found the name Hor on the printed facsimile that Joseph inserted in the Book of Abraham. Hor is seen everywhere on the existing papyri and also on Joseph's reproduction of facsimile number 3. Therefore, it's reasonable to infer the scene shown in facsimile number 3 ended the original series of papyri, which have now been translated properly and are known as the Book of Breathing. This scroll was prepared for the man Hor, who died and needed the magical papyrus which contained the charms necessary to reach the world of the hereafter. Even the famous Mormon scholar and apologist, Hugh Nubley, was willing to concede facsimile number 3 was probably part of the original papyri placed at the left-hand end of the scroll. We have all the papyri Joseph Smith used to translate the Book of Abraham. He used 5 fragments to translate the book. JSP1 was the source for the drawings Smith later called facsimile number 1. He used JSP11 and JSP10 for the text of the Book of Abraham, and he used the lost papyri containing the drawing he later called facsimile number 3 to illustrate the book. And finally, Smith inserted the drawing he later called facsimile number 2 from another piece of the papyri are related to JSP1, 11, and 10 into the middle of the text. Even if they are missing pieces of papyri from the original set purchased by Joseph Smith, those missing pieces have nothing to do with the text of the Book of Abraham. Let's evaluate the claim related to a missing papyrus another way. So according to chapter 1 verse 12, Abraham allegedly included a drawing of the attempt to slay him at the commencement of this record. The drawing from the original papyri matches facsimile number 1 in the Book of Abraham. If Joseph had another roll of papyrus containing the Book of Abraham, why didn't he use the drawing Abraham said he placed at the beginning of that roll? Why would Smith switch over to the pagan Book of Breathing and use an illustration, that's facsimile number 1, from this roll? Why would Smith then include facsimile number 3 at the end of the record? Remember, the name Hor can clearly be read in the hieroglyphics on facsimile number 3, and this drawing was, according to Hugh Nibley and other scholars, originally located at the end of the Book of Breathing papyrus. Are we to believe that Joseph rejected the drawing Abraham himself put at the beginning of his record, and added a substitute and 2 other drawings from the pagan Book of Breathing unrelated to Abraham? This seems highly unreasonable. Many Mormon apologists, after investigating this evidence, have come to the conclusion that we actually have all the papyri that Joseph used for the Book of Abraham. They also admit Smith's rendition does not reflect the accurate translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics on those papyri. As a result, they now claim Joseph obtained his Book of Abraham by way of direct revelation and not from a translation on the papyrus. They claim God inspired Joseph and revealed the text of the Book of Abraham, using the papyri only as an inspirational tool. The words came to Joseph directly from God, independent of the papyri. According to these apologists, the papyri simply served as a visual foundation from which God miraculously revealed something entirely different. This explanation contradicts everything Joseph Smith ever wrote or allowed to be published about the subject. It is clear from Joseph's own writing he translated the Book of Abraham from the characters he found on the papyri. At the beginning of the handwritten manuscripts of the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith asserted it was a translation of the Book of Abraham written by his own hand upon papyrus and found in the catacombs of Egypt. The introduction to the Book of Abraham still maintains it was translated from the papyrus by Joseph Smith. Current claims that the Book of Abraham was not translated from the papyri deny over 150 years of Mormon teaching on the subject and the very words of Joseph himself. His alphabet and grammar clearly describes Smith translating the papyri character for character. At this point, the evidence related to the Book of Abraham papyri leaves only reasonable inference. Despite the efforts of Mormons to restore the reliability of the Book of Abraham, it appears to be a demonstrably false book, erroneously translated and misrepresented as scripture by the Latter-day Saints Church. The book undermines the claims of Joseph Smith related to other allegedly divinely inspired translations, including the Book of Mormon.